excuse you from the thing, Tony, maybe we should kick you out. Hold on.
Whatever.
He just did.
Is he in the waiting room now? And
he's in the waiting room. I thought it'd be more organic that way.
That's right. He doesn't get to do the intro then.
No, I'm gonna get him. I'm gonna get him in. I'm just.
Could he still hear
us? Hold on. Is someone trying to call? Don't let anybody call. All right. Cool.
Oh wait. Yeah, let me put on.
Yeah. Hold on. Ladies and gentlemen, you are watching and listening to the Holy Ruckus podcast live edition.
Yep.
We're about to get into it. We haven't started. Well, we're on, but we're not like not super on. No, I'm gonna get him. We're not super on yet, but we'll give folks a segundo to get in on this chat here. But until then, let us know that you're here. Say what up in the comments. Let us know how you're feeling. But let us begin. All right, people are hopping on in. All right, man. Let's do it, Padre. How you doing? How you feeling?
I'm feeling great, man. This has been one of those weeks where there was just a lot of like online training and stuff. So been having some interesting conversations and then less than interesting.
All right, we got Dominique Seraphin. Hey there. You know Dom, Father? You know there's people commenting? Yeah. Here we go. All right, guys. So let's start with a little intro and let's get into it.
We've got some fresh new young talent doing some things that I know you haven't heard before.
Let's bring the Ruckus.
Why were you made? I was made to be happy. The way to be happy is to know truth, to love goodness. In other words, I am made for God.
Pero quiero lío en la diócesis. Quiero que se salga afuera.
You are now listening to the Holy Ruckus podcast.
Yay, fake applause.
You added Papa Francis.
Papa Benedicto. Yes, I did. Let's bring him in. It is not just us today, Father. It is me, you, and Anthony Esser. Welcome. Here we go. Boom.
Hey, how's it going?
I told you I'd bring you back.
I was backstage, man.
There you go. Guys, welcome. Father, you and I do this. We're pretty frequent in the social mediums every week doing the Holy Ruckus podcast. But now we have a special guest, a good friend of the show, a good friend of ours, and a part of the Holy Ruckus, a contributor regularly. Mr. I know him as Tony Esser. So, golf claps for you, man. Thanks so much for being a part of this.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. I'm really psyched to be here. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Tony, I'm not going to treat you any different than I would any of my kids or any of my other guests. We're talking rapid fire questions. This is what we do, man. And usually they're going to end up as softball questions, like very just easy. And they're going to be like yes or no, but who knows? We'll see what it is. So otherwise, we'll begin here. All right. So, and I'll put some graphics in here. I'll put some sound effects. But for now, word association. Whatever I say, I want you to come up with something. Your wife says, "Hey, babe."
She's trying to throw me off, but I'm ready. I'm ready. I'm not letting her get in my head.
Rapid fire.
All right.
Here goes. Your most once upon a time, I know that you were a big emo cat. What's your favorite emo band?
Okay, so if I'm to reach into the depths, I'm gonna say Seosin.
Seosin?
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. I love Seosin. That's good. Okay, reaching back. Franciscan University.
Yeah. Households.
Okay. Good answer. Let's say favorite pope.
Francis.
Okay. Do you believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth? Do you believe in the church and everything she teaches?
I do.
There you go. Just making sure, folks, I know you were thinking, you saw the headline, loved by God. You thought, oh no, Is this
Hey, we got to check all the boxes here,
folks? We got it. All right, we got it. All right. Your most controversial film that's your favorite, like that most people hate, but you.
Oh, geez, this is a great question.
Now, is he allowed to say
Sister Act 2? I just had a friend the other day give me a hard time. I love Sister Act 2.
There you go, Father. Did these resonate at all with you?
I would have said The Room, but I don't know. Like that's supposed to be one that's terrible that you're supposed to like, right? It's like
The Room.
Jodie Foster?
No. The Tommy Wiseau film.
No. Oh yes. Oh my God.
Hi, Mark.
Yeah.
Hi, Mark.
Oh, hi, Mark.
Oh, hi, Mark.
Yo, it took some convincing to get my wife to watch that with me. It is so good.
It's good reason.
Amazing.
It's tearing me apart, Lisa.
No, I did not.
If we get in any trouble today, like
it's official. I have cancer.
Oh my gosh, I know, of all the things.
Oh my gosh. Okay. On the flip side, your least favorite movie of faith.
Least favorite movie?
Oh, yeah, let's
of faith. What was that one? Courageous? Was it one of the like Kirk Cameron ones? What was that early Kirk Cameron one? Was it Courageous or was
Left Behind series?
He did do the Left Behind series, but he was in that. What was that one about marriage? That early one.
Comment section. Let us know. Kirk Cameron was in a movie where
I think it was Kirk Cameron.
He yells at his wife.
Remember, they're like getting into it, but then he's like at the fire department, like trying to get his act together. Fireproof. Yes. Fireproof. Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, as you're listening, what is your least favorite movie of faith that maybe everybody loves and you're just like, is it though? Is it good though? Like, you never know. So there you go. Father, I'll ask you, even though you're here too. What's your least favorite movie of faith?
I could probably get some really nasty comments if I mentioned which VeggieTales I didn't appreciate. But I'll just keep it real. So one that really, really was hard for me to get through as a youngster, that now operates like it now is probably like more nostalgia. The Bells of St. Mary's. It's like an old
Bing Crosby.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like Bing as I'm used to him. It's not like White Christmas Bing or like singing and dancing,
Okay. So on the other side then, okay, what's your favorite faith movie, Tony?
My favorite movie of faith? Okay, actually, yeah. So I have a new one. I don't know if people would categorize it as this, but A Hidden Life.
Oh.
It was a movie that was released in the past couple years, I think. Same guy, the director's escaping my mind, did Brad Pitt's was in it, the Tree of Life. Yeah. Kind of very known for the like slow, artsy, kind of like voiceover type movie, but it's about A Hidden Life. It's about a guy in Nazi-occupied Austria who's asked to like take an oath of fealty to the Third Reich.
And the one that just came out.
Yeah.
It came out in the past like year or two, but I watched it. I wanted to watch it during Lent, but we just like didn't. We ended up like not having the time or whatever. We watched it just after, and I tell you what, like I know people make a big a tradition of watching like the Passion of the Christ during Holy Week. I think that movie is as good as any reflection on during Holy Week, because the passion that he goes through, having to like make this decision to potentially sacrifice his life and everything that goes along with that is it's pretty heavy, but like very meditative. Like the movie itself is really beautiful.
Okay.
It did come out within the last year. That was Terrence Malick.
Yes, Terrence Malick. Thank you.
That's with Franz Jager.
If you're ever looking for another movie, check out Marcelino Panivino. I don't know if it's one.
I've heard of it. Yeah.
Is this little boy who goes and brings bread and wine to statue Jesus who comes alive. It's wild. And the funniest part is when little boy gets stung by a scorpion I die every time. Anyway, I mean, and then the priest, I think, sucks out the venom or something. Like he lives.
What's the name of it? Marco Panini.
Marcelino Panivino.
Panivino. We sold that one at the Basilica bookstore when I worked there.
Okay, so in my short bio, I was gonna say, and he worked at the Basilica bookstore. Why are Catholic books so expensive? Can you just help me out?
I think it's like any brick and mortar bookstore. I don't necessarily think Catholic books themselves are expensive unless you're talking about someone who's like self-published, or it's like a smaller publisher where they just can't afford to like give big at-cost discounts or something. But I think that's more the reason.
Your discount?
What was my discount?
Oh,
I don't remember what the like employee discount was.
It better be 50.
I don't want.
Come on. Basilica National Shrine Bookstore. Basilica.
No, well, I'll tell you what, because we had the bookstore and then the gift shop across the foyer, and the bookstore you can't like mark up that much. So it wasn't like this a 50% discount, because that's a part of the thing with books is like we're not making that much money on book sales.
You get a little hookup at the cafeteria.
Oh, you know it, yeah.
What? There you go.
I get those mashed potatoes. I used to get the breakfast like hash. Potatoes and eggs and stuff. That was my jam.
There you go. All right, let's talk about bisexuality. Ladies and gentlemen, well, what are we doing? Well,
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Let's get into it, man. Ain't nothing to it but to do it. So I got both my boys, my friends, on here on the podcast with me. But let me do it proper. And you passed, by the way. The word association went way longer than it needed to. So whatever.
I hope it was worth it, everyone.
It was very worth it. After earning, it like humanizes you. After earning his bachelor's in Catechetics from Franciscan, Anthony has worked with youth and young adult ministry, most recently for the ADW for the Archdiocese of Washington as Coordinator of Parish Evangelization. He serves as the chairman of the Paulist Reconciliation Ministries Board. Say that like really, really fast. And has volunteered with Eden Invitation, a ministry and community for young adults who experience same-sex desires. He has co-hosted a podcast about friendship called Better With You. Check that out. And is working as a freelance photographer and graphic designer. His work can be found on anthonyesser.com. He is recently and is a longstanding from the beginning of starting and launching the Holy Ruckus. He has contributed blogs, and he has recently published a personal essay called Love by God. And my emails have not been the same ever since. Thanks so much for being here, my man.
Yeah, no problem. And thanks for taking that bullet for me. It was really
and
an important conversation.
It's Father's fault that you're here, because he really, his curiosity was piqued. And so very good. Father, what do you got for my man? Like, I mean, what do you got? Opening statements. Like,
oh man,
what are we doing here? Why is the topic?
A word of thanks to Tony for joining us today and giving us the opportunity, especially on this platform, to share even more of your heart. So you poured out your heart into this article, which is also posted on both your blog and then the Holy Ruckus blog as well. So if listeners haven't checked it out, after this conversation or simultaneously along with this conversation, you can look up Love by God, which is the by is a play on word. It's a reference to your own journey in life, your own vocation, your own learning to live and accept and love God as a bisexual man. So can we reference the fact that this is this is not your typical version of our podcast here, and it's maybe not one that people are like all that excited about tuning in for, because it can be kind of intimidating. Do you feel any of that intimidation factor when you share on this, when you talk from your heart on this topic?
Yeah, of course. For sure. I think that unfortunately, there's like a lot of pressure put on people when they talk openly about being a sexual minority, whether that's I might lose my job, I might be ostracized from my community in some way, including my family. I mean, the largest proportion of young homeless people are LGBTQ young people, and that's been for such a long time. And
I didn't know that.
or even just facing some of the kind of scrutiny, that we might talk about here a little bit. But I think like something that's important for me to kind of share going into this discussion is like someone recently told me this quote that unfortunately I really don't know the source of, where they talk about like, we're lucky being in the church. We have these kind of like guardrails of church teaching, of church doctrine, right? And so, but there's this whole road between those guardrails that we can walk in our journey of faith, and in trying to learn how to navigate issues like this, or complicated issues like sexuality or racism or anything else. And there's room in that whole road for different approaches, different paths, different journeys. And the church has a huge history of development of doctrine, of having different perspectives and spiritualities and approaches to things. That's why we have stuff like spiritual direction, so people can like navigate and find like, what is the way that God is calling me personally to walk things. But I think that, like one example is like I use the term bisexual to describe my sexual orientation. And a lot of people in the church, and I've received this feedback even since publishing the article, is that that's like the language of the world, and like using that language like identifies with sin rather than my place in Christ's family or whatever. And I think we can like have that language about, I'm not necessarily here to like debate why I think it's descriptive language, and we could go into that, but I think more importantly is to understand that that's not like a matter of orthodoxy, right? Like for me to use that word doesn't contradict anything within church teaching. And so I think that like, we need to approach these conversations with courage, and honesty, and also a sense of mercy, because I think people can also just be like uncomfortable, right? Like we use the term homophobia, and I think wisely so, because I think a lot of where that scrutiny comes from, or a lot of uncharity or discrimination, is from a place of fear. And it could be fear of a lot of different things. But I think it is a place of fear. And so I think if we go into these conversations with a sense of courage, I think that we can see a lot more. We just benefit a lot. Like, for example, and I'll pass it back to you, but I want to give this other example. I have a friend who identifies as gay and is Catholic, and because he's committed to being single, he's not like dating or giving his time to a girlfriend or a wife. So he visits the neonatal intensive care unit at a hospital around him, and he volunteers to like hold the babies there. And he also dresses as a superhero and visits the kids in the cancer center. I mean, this is a person whose witness is like definitely deserves to be shared, right? And I think when we create an environment of like fear and disproportionate scrutiny on people, we miss out on like seeing the beautiful ways that people are making God's love present, and the ways that he's working in people's lives like that.
Amen. I love that image of the road you evoked, because I mean, that's kind of, it immediately calls to mind like the idea of walking with Jesus on the road to Emmaus. There's definitely boundaries to it, and we're going to keep our conversation on that road, within those rails, because we know that broad and wide is the road that leads to destruction, but the one that leads to freedom, it still has room for us to walk side by side along one another, because if Jesus is showing us the way, that's the way he said.
And on that road,
the fact that you have received pushback on like the idea that your identification, your use of a descriptor is like, I guess one of the very things that people can't seem to agree on. It's like a barrier of entry to having this conversation. I think a lot of people just don't want to talk about this sort of thing because of the discomfort level, but then also like what language do we use? Do we use person, based language, or does it help us just cut to the chase when we know who you are and part of your story, even from the use of a single word? You yourself mentioned this in your article, that it's like at times you're not sure even how to go about sharing, your own story, or the words that you were given come from, a place of a memory of pain, but then also of that pain being healed. So can you tell us just right off from the get-go, like what's the happiest, most blessed part of your journey that you've experienced, so that people can kind of be encouraged that this is one of hope, an overwhelming message of hope?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, because I really do think that a lot of times we enter into these discussions with that. Like, for example, some of the language that was really popular as I was growing up is this notion of struggling with same-sex attraction. And certainly there have been a lot of struggles, and everyone has struggles in their faith journey. But I am at a place now of personal integration that I don't really see myself as struggling, particularly with my sexual orientation. And I think instead, I appreciate the question, because that's so much of my mission in speaking about my experience is to call people to hope, and we're a resurrection people, right? And so talking about what is beautiful and how God is calling us to fulfilled life, no matter what our experience. And I think for me, seeing in recent years, as I've become more involved in communities of people who identify as LGBT or same-sex attracted, who are Christian, and seeing, I gave that example of the guy who has that beautiful witness and volunteers in that beautiful way. But there's so many other people who, whether they're Catholic people or Christian people who serve as pastors or volunteers, and in different ways, and the ministry that they do, not only to support other people with a similar experience, but just to support each other as a community, and to find healing from those difficult experiences where they may have experienced discrimination in the past, to call people on, and just to walk in the Lord. I think we have this perception that people, that are in a sexual minority, it's we have this, again, we coming back to the fear. I think a lot of parents have this fear when my child comes out to me, oh my gosh, they're going to be lost. And that's where a lot of this, don't use that language of the world. Don't do this. Don't become friends with another gay person. It's this fear that we're going to lose them to a certain sexual behavior or something that we think isn't, is sinful. But I think that there's this huge cloud of witnesses of people who have this experience like me, but are so faithful, and just even separate from this experience, have a beautiful witness of faith. And so I think that's what's brought me so much joy. Is I went on a retreat last year with one of these communities of people, and just singing praise and worship with them and reading scripture, and it had not even necessarily anything to do with our experience as sexual minorities, but just being together with people who love the Lord. And then this was a shared experience, was really beautiful.
So if I may, Tony,
yeah.
On this road with you, and even in your experience, even recently, you're not alone. I mean, obviously, church and that, but you're not alone in the real sense, because we should have said in the beginning, you're married. You're married by your beautiful wife Casey, and your kids. Talk about that and how that's changed or amplified, or just the witness, right, that you're giving now as a husband, as a father, in the sacrament of marriage.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it is important to bring that up, both because there's a lot that I've learned in being a married person and living out that vocation, and also to point out what we've not specifically mentioned, that is my experience is very particular. My experience, there's a lot of people who are choosing to live a celibate life as a way to pursue their vocation, or who are living in some kind of intentional community, or even committed friendships and different things. And so my experience is my experience. It's not to say it doesn't apply to some things we don't share, but I'm just sensitive to that. But yeah, my wife is incredibly supportive, maybe even sometimes more than, she's even more eager for me to share and be open and kind of pursue God's will for me in the uncomfortable ways that, even before I feel ready, she sees and has encouraged me in those things, which is, again, awesome, because other people sometimes have projected that fear. Well, have you thought about what's your wife going to say, or what? And then I want to be man, you don't know her. You don't know how God is working in our life. We have prayed and talked and spent time together, and we move into stuff like this conversation, very much on the same page. But by the time that like we've had this conversation about my sexuality long before we were married too, is an important thing to note. You know, like everyone, the first months and even years of our dating life, we were kind of gradually getting to know each other, and that was a part of myself I shared with her early on, and by the time we got married, as she would tell you, as she told me, that she loved this part of me, just as she loved every other part of me, and she didn't marry me in spite of it. She married every part of who I am. Now, obviously, that said, when you enter into a marriage, you give a part of your sexuality exclusively to your spouse. And so, for me, it's like, however, like everyone desires some level of intimacy even outside of their marital relationship, and like that's important. So I think there's this like bigger image too of like what does intimacy mean, and like where do we talk about intimacy versus sexuality. So that's something I think as we were preparing for marriage and entering into marriage, it was exploring, like, as I pursue this relationship of intimacy, how does it give me just like a fuller understanding of like what intimacy is and how that relates to sexuality and my particular experience of sexuality. So I've been lucky to like have someone so supportive and so faith-filled to navigate that journey with me.
Well, you really said a couple of my favorite buzzwords there. You've already used community or communion and intimacy. I find the latter is especially, it's like both really well known. Like everybody thinks we know what we're talking about when we're saying like, oh, being intimate with one another. Like that certainly is a euphemistic expression. But it kind of drives home the reality that actually, no, we're not on the same page most of the time when we're talking about intimacy, especially in a Christian context informed by the gospel, really modeling the kind of intimacy that Christ himself offers his own beloved. He has, of course, his closest friends and a special relationship with the 12. But then even within the 12, there's like a subset of, his relationship with James and John and Peter. And then he calls John, of those three, the beloved disciple. And which is to say nothing of like, how close he must have felt to his mother, to Mary Magdalene, to Lazarus, to Mary and Martha. All that to say that how come I'm going to throw you under the bus. But although I don't think you'll be surprised by this, because you talk about this, this desire for intimacy is a desire to share the wholeness of our human personhood, which doesn't exclude the gift of human sexuality from the Lord. It's not like that part goes in brackets and is only used at specific times in our lives, insofar as every single one of us possesses the gift of sexuality. It allows us to experience intimacy in different ways with different people. Tony, why is this topic reduced to a whole bunch of, don't you do that? Like, don't be touching that. Don't be doing that. You can't do this. You can't do that. I mean, like, thou shalt not have their place, right? We have the ninth commandments for a reason, but why is the whole conversation often reduced to this one thing of just like, well, you don't do that, right? Like, you ain't been doing that stuff, right?
Yeah, I think it's like such a good question. And I think a lot of us in my generation kind of grew up in the like purity culture of the 90s and stuff, and see examples of how that's lived out of like, even community as men in like a men's talk. The center of that community was, how are you supporting each other in not doing this stuff? Is like, are you supporting each other and holding each other accountable when it comes to living chastity in this very particular type of way, as opposed to like understanding like, how do we talk about our experience of sexuality in a comfortable way? Like, how do we communicate at all? Like we're being told to like have these like accountability relationships when like young teenage boys don't know how to talk, let alone talk about like their sexual feelings. But that being the negative, I had this really profound experience in confession one time. I'll give a positive example and then kind of go into maybe a better way to start thinking about this is, I went to confession with this Franciscan priest in DC. And besides my sins, obviously, I shared with him my experience of living as a sexual minority within the church and some of my kind of frustrations. And his response was in part like just that many in the church don't have a mature sense of sexuality. And until we develop a better perspective, we're going to keep making mistakes and hurting people like you and people in your situation. And like, that was such like a touching and profound experience for me to experience such like humility from a priest of the church. But I mean, he was right. Like in terms of like how we talk about sexuality, especially same-sex attraction or homosexuality, we do so in like such limited terms, right? John Paul II, I think, talked about and you can correct me if I'm like misquoting him, but talked about the problem with pornography, about like the problem with it is not that it shows too much, but that it shows too little. And I almost think, and I'm going to get like attacked for this, but I mean, hope maybe it'll shake it up a little bit. I think the way that we as a church culture talk about sexuality is kind of pornographic, right? We talk about sex. We talk about like sexual intercourse and sex acts, and that's how we understand sexuality. And the problem with that is not that it's too much or too graphic, but it's that it shows too little. It's the same problem. Our understanding and approach to sexuality, if we really want to have a deep theology of the body and the way that we actually accompany people, should follow John Paul II's example, and it should include more. And that's evident in just how we live our human experience, right? Sexuality is all about how we relate to other people, how we show affection to our parents, a sibling, a close friend, and that's also going to vary by our culture, right? And so there's not like we sometimes have like set up these strict rules, but that's all. It's a false premise, because this is all about intimacy, a way of finding it, and in a way that corresponds to our values, our understanding of goodness and truth, right? And so to kind of like build off of that idea of intimacy, and feel free to just like to jump in, but we already talked about my wife Casey, right? And we brought up this idea of like intimacy and sexuality. So as her and I were like preparing for marriage, we took these NFP classes. Josh, my man, knows what I'm talking about. NFP, right? Natural Family Planning, and one of the things that they talked to us about was, because of course part of the premise of natural family planning is that if you're trying to if you discern to avoid becoming pregnant and you're reading signs and things, what you do is abstain from having sex, right? And so the practitioner, as a part of just their program, talks about this thing called SPICE, which is an acronym for other ways to find intimacy with your partner during those times of abstinence. So SPICE stood for spiritual, physical, intellectual, creative, and emotional intimacy. So what I wonder looking back on that experience is like why we can't have that broad of an understanding of intimacy, outside of that discussion. Like, why can't we apply that broad and rich discussion of intimacy, understanding of intimacy and sexuality? Because there's still like sexuality at play there too. It's not divorced from sexuality. It's like our sexual desires are not always lustful, but they're just this magnetic feeling that draws us towards other people, and how we engage with those, how we fulfill that desire for intimacy with people, whether it's physical affection or prayer, even, or creative intellectual discussion, is really important. It's very natural. It's supernatural, but it's also very natural. And is also something available to people of the same sex, right? I still have intimacy with my father, with my close male friends, with mentors, and that can even be physical intimacy, right? Of showing affection and everything else. So I think that is kind of like, I would love for us to reframe broadly the discussion of sexuality, but especially when we talk about sexual minorities and issues of sexuality, that we come into it understanding that sexuality is more than just sex or even sex acts, but is this desire for intimacy and this magnetism that draws us to other people.
Ooh, say more. Gosh, Amen. Like, preach, brother. That's like, I think all that sex is sexy. So like, what gets the most attention is like the genital expression of it, or like the acts themselves. But it's a very limited way. Like, just like you said, it's so this may be a poor comparison, but it's definitely been the experience of many a seminarian, myself included, while discerning celibacy, that revealing this part of my life, at any given time to some of my peers, classmates in college or whatever, would like open up the immediate and but like still very stunted question of like, so you're just not gonna have sex? That's just it? Like that's it for you? Or what? Like, I was like, yeah, well, there's a whole lot more to it than that. But if I may, that I feel opens the door for these conversations with people of any walk of life, couples like you and Casey in marriage prep, who learn NFP and other ways to express intimacy with one another. But the intimacy of friendship also raises questions. If we really believe what we say we believe, like whenever we pray the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, right? That is itself a mouthful, and the product of like our gradual understanding that Christ himself was like us in every way except for sin. Like, that's the Chalcedonian formula of like so Christ
Right.
experienced intimacy and the integration of his entire personhood. So it's entirely possible to imagine, like,
10th graders.
how did Christ do spice?
Right.
How was the spice of life in
Well,
Christ?
I think the real question there is like, how did Christ experience sexuality, right? And like, nobody wants to talk about that. But I think that's perhaps like the example. That's like the question, right? Because if sexuality and by extension sexual orientation is all about a desire for sex acts with other people that inevitably leads to lust, which is really a lot of that's the extra connection we make with people in sexual minorities, is not only is a desire for sex acts, but it inevitably leads to lust and is in itself disordered because it's so focused on these sinful sex acts. But if that's how we think of sex in that limited and kind of and direct and narrow terms, then talking about Christ's sexuality becomes really weird, right? We don't want to think about Christ wanting sex with other humans, but if we think about this broader experience of sexuality as a desire for intimacy with others, well, of course, that's incredibly biblical. That's like a gospel reality that Christ, as you mentioned, had a beloved disciple, or that he wept for his friend Lazarus, right? Or that, his desire to gather apostles to himself, or have favored followers or friends, I mean, as God. But that's his experience of humanity, is grounded in a sexuality and a magnetism that draws other people. Now, I don't know what exactly that looked like. Obviously, none of us do on this side of heaven. But again, as you said, if he's like us in all things but sin, then one can imagine, he had gender. He was also a sexual being, and that's not icky or gross or blasphemous. It's just the human reality. And so how do we reconcile that? How do we view sexuality now as something that is holy?
I'm fascinated that you're also, this co-host of a podcast on friendship. Is that one of the ways to a more holistic understanding of ourselves as a communion of persons, a fuller recovery of philia, the love of friendship?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I love that you brought up my podcast. We had a meager 9 episodes, but I love doing it. And in fact, I recorded another interview that I didn't end up releasing, but definitely will at some point. Maybe I'll do something through the Holy Ruckus, that was with a Mother Superior for the Discalced Carmelites, kind of south of where I live, and interviewed her because I wanted the perspective on friendship of it. It wasn't a Catholic podcast. It was on friendship in general. So we had all kinds of different people on, but I wanted that perspective not only of someone in a religious, with a religious background, but someone in a cloister, right, where community is such a focus of their lives, and yet it's also such a particular kind of community, an expression of community. And I tell you, like, perhaps the most joyful people that I've ever met in my life are religious sisters in cloister. And that's so contrary to how, like, we often understand, like, joy and happiness and pleasure, and, like, is to be in the world and to be taking advantage of everything that life has to offer us. And yet, like, these men and women who live community together and find through their incredibly focused prayer lives deep intimacy with the Lord, they're, like, so joyful. I mean, they just radiate joy from people who come to visit them. And so I think that, and so that's what I discussed with her, was this, like, idea of relationships within the convent. And in a lot of ways, their relationships are very ordinary in some of the, like, problems they have to navigate relating to each other, and yet, like, the deep love that they have for each other as well. And it's also a committed love, right? In living in the kind of community that they have particular boundaries on their way of life that honor God's will for their lives. They have, we talk about vocation, right? And so I think that a lot of people, kind of coming back to the specific discussion about people in a sexual minority, seek out not only friendships for the sake of having intimacy, that they desire with same-sex people, that we desire with same-sex people, but also forming sometimes those committed friendships or intentional communities that bring that mutual support and discernment into a more formal, kind of committed, supportive situation. And that idea of, like, committed friendships or celibate partnerships is kind of a hot topic, of course. I don't know if we want to get into it, but in a sense, like, we have those communities of committed friendships and relationships in the culture. And there's a ton more to say about friendship, right? I mean, I mentioned earlier, I see a comment came in from Annie McHugh about friendship being a lost art in our culture, right? And that young people are sometimes labeled gay just because they're close friends with someone of the same sex. And I think she's right on, but it also kind of goes back to what I said earlier about, like, how we show affection is largely cultural, right? Like, sometimes as Christians, we want to narrow those guardrails for ourselves, which is actually how a lot of ancient heresies operated, that we have special knowledge and our idea of what doctrine is should be more narrow. But the reality is that a lot of these things that we think are right or wrong are actually just culturally based, and we can move those understandings in different directions. So I think that what Annie very wisely points out is that our oversexed culture, right, doesn't just result in people who are sexually promiscuous. It actually can result of an isolation of people, right? Because sexuality is very personal, and entering into a sexual relationship makes us really vulnerable. So if the world is kind of oversexed, if sexuality is very present in all of our relationships and all around us, then we can actually isolate from other people as a matter of fear, to say, well, I don't want to get close to that other guy because I don't know what that's going to say about me, or I don't know what mixed messages I'm going to send him, because sex is just, like, so permeated in the world. And again, like, kind of going back to that too much, too little thing, I think it's not a matter of, like, creating more boundaries and boxes and more fear, but it's just to talk more about sexuality, and again, like, just go back to talking more about intimacy, and that, like, it's okay, like, to have a really close guy friend. And if you're a parent of a young kid who has I think there's little ways that we manifest this, to not make comments, or be suspicious or ask weird questions of the kid, just to affirm that, like, oh, it's so beautiful that, like, you have this really good friend, and, like, that's awesome. I think friendship is super important. Even in marriage, that's, not something that we forsake. We need friendships outside of marriage, and I certainly have super close male friends, and that's a huge way that I've, like, integrated my desire for male intimacy into my adult life and into my vocation of marriage. And my wife is super supportive of that. There's no kind of, like, jealousy or suspicion there or anything, right? Because she's super hip to the idea that like we all need intimacy. You know, she goes and has a prayer group with some ladies that she spends time, you know, that she works with. She has her sister that she's super close to, people that she talks late at night on the phone with. And, you know, and so do I have like super close guy friends, some who are straight and some who are not. And our friendship is in a lot of ways just super normal, but is also like really fulfilling of those like magnetic desires that I have.
There you go. There you go, man. More than one or two ways for intimacy. Spice. Look it up, folks. Spice. Anyway,
we're getting spicy here today.
Spicy. Father Pat, let's take a little break there, Spicy Pat. I almost said Spicy Pete.
I think the best part of how you shared, you know, by taking us through those, you know, different walks.
Did you just spell out the S?
You spelled out, yes. Yeah.
Share.
I'm going to send mixed messages.
Go ahead, we're going to take a break.
You look at, you know, the 45th minute, you know, he's giving us, you know, subtle hints. I'd say that every single one of those walks of life that you just mentioned not only is capable of achieving an appropriate integrated intimacy, but we're all called to live the life of virtue too. At the same time, we're all called to live the life of chastity. So every married couple is shooting for that goal. Every person of faith is, you know, striving for that goal. You know, building ourselves up, building the kingdom within, so that we can build the kingdom without. And that's shared common ground. You know, I feel like finding the common ground is like the tricky part of the conversation, because there's a lot that divides. You know, I got to throw a kind of a curveball at you.
You're throwing all these curveballs.
I'm gonna throw this
thing.
This question came into me, and it comes from a place of kind of shared hurt. You know, you do a great job in your blog, your article, about talking about, you know, what you thought went wrong and what you thought went right. And I think you even can detect in your writing style the intimation that sometimes some of that stuff that went wrong led to, you know, more giftedness, you know, more blessedness in your life. You know, it's hard for us to like completely label things as like, this was all bad and this is all, but like some people are so hurt because while they're trying to like uphold what the church believes about marriage, you know, about your marriage and all marriages, some families have been put in this like just this gut-wrenching position where they've had to sit out, you know, the marriage ceremony or wedding ceremony of their sibling or cousin, or, you know, their loved one, you know, who was marrying a person of the same sex. So how does your experience of your marriage, you know, and the dying to self that has called you to, your desire for holiness with your wife, you know, how do you encourage people going through that cross, both the cross of like living with the no's that come with our yeses, right? Because every yes does have an implicit no. You know, I say yes to my vocation of the priesthood, and that means no to some other things. You know, I'm not called to marriage, right? So how would you pastor someone who's going through that kind of agony?
Yeah, so you're talking about someone who like it finds themselves like a sexual minority or same-sex attracted or whatever, right? Because you were talking, or just or a relative, or anyone touched. Okay,
want to love their relative and want to be there and close, and support their relative, but without like, you know, approving, you know, that their choice to enter into a same-sex marriage or something like that, but still have that desire to be present to, because that's a pain, you know, of accompaniment as well.
Yeah. Gosh, I think there's so many conversations, right, that we could have around all those issues. And I think that, I think first of all, it's to go back to kind of what I was saying before about entering into these conversations with a sense of humility, and courage and honesty. I think that if you're, because I think a lot of these things are incredibly loaded, and we go into these conversations with preconceived notions sometimes of what's right and what's wrong, and again, like what's orthodox or unorthodox, and that's on kind of both sides of the equation. So someone who would advise you go to the wedding or don't go to the wedding, like both of those are absolutes, right? Or and have strong judgments or whatever. And the reality is that, like, that question, for example, is one of conscience in addition to pastoral accompaniment, and so it's not one that like I can give an answer to directly for any one person. But I think that I also want to point back to, as a foundation, you're highlighting the idea that like that the commonality between all of our states of life is also sacrifice, right? And so I think too, like what I thought when you were talking about, like, as a priest, there's certain things that I give up. Like, it's also not just marriage and not just sex. Like, you give up a lot of other things, right, to be a priest, and even specifically, like, outside of your vocation broadly, the way that God calls you to minister means saying, no to some kind of work, or geographic closeness maybe to someone who you had to move away from, or whatever. Like, there's all kinds of ways that God constantly calls us ultimately to something greater that he has planned for us, right? And it can feel like a dying to ourselves, and it can feel like a no to ourselves. And a lot of times I think, for example, there's a lot of issues within this conversation that I don't know the answers to, even things that affect my own life. And a lot of times I have to really, as kind of cheesy as kitsch as it might sound, like walk in faith. And there's certain, obviously I seek out greater understanding and greater closeness with the Lord and his desire for my life. But there are times where I take the teaching of the church at its word, or the call to conscience by a mentor or something, because I don't understand. And then there are other times that I form my conscience the best I can and trust my conscience and the righteousness of that which the church asks us to do as well, right? I think that's Pope Francis. I don't want to confidently say where, but I think recently talked about that like the person is not to be kind of controlled by these absolutes, but is, just he reaffirmed like the idea of conscience. We have a responsibility to form it, but then also people have the responsibility to act according to that conscience, and not just by like political mandates, for example, and to be beholden to a political party, for example. So I think that to kind of get to your question, like, how would I pastor those people? I think that to make all of that much simpler, I'll speak first to somebody, like a relative of someone who has this experience, and would highlight the idea of humility. So as you would go into these conversations with your family member, or even prayer, or a conversation with a spiritual mentor, really do some self-reflection, and try to determine what all is in your heart. What are the fears? What are the hopes? What are the disappointments? And just be really honest with yourself about those things, because if you are talking about a loved one who you want to accompany, along their journey of faith toward the will of God for their life, then it's not about you, right? Or your agenda. And that's not to say that God can't work through our own hearts, or the Holy Spirit can't move through us, but we also have to kind of weed out what is of the Holy Spirit inspiring us, and what is of fear and pride and nervousness, or even scrupulosity. And so I think just taking some time to reflect before sending that text message, or posting that Facebook post, or getting coffee with that person, even if it's just a breath that you have to take before responding to someone before you, and just try to bring yourself into that place of like, this isn't about me. Let me not try to automatically react. And that's really a safe, a kind of like safety check, is just to not be immediately reactive, right? But to try to at least start from a place of listening. And Pope Francis has affirmed that over and over again in his writings, right? He talks about accompaniment, and the art of listening, and the importance of listening, and has a lot in his writings, advises us of the practical ways to do that. But ultimately, it has to begin with this attitude, what he describes as removing our sandals before the sacred ground of the other. And so we can often look at other people as a project, as someone that we need to like fix or convince of something. And that leads to like a lot of fear and nervousness over like, oh, I might not be able to do that, or what happens if I don't do that? But the reality is, not only is that other person a sacred life separate from your agenda, but they're also God's child. Even if they're your own biological child, the even higher reality is that they're the Lord's. And so start from that place of humility, and also trust in the Lord's capacity to work in their life. And to people who might share my experience, have same-sex desires, or identify as gay or lesbian or queer or trans or whatever, I kind of will echo what I said in my essay. And that is, regardless of where you are in your journey of faith or journey of integration and humanity and sexuality, is that the church can be a home for you. And we can be honest about what the teachings of the church are, and what we are called to as Catholic Christians, how we believe that the Lord calls us to live out our whole experience of sexuality. There are certain ways that we are called and that honor Him, that but we can and we should be honest about those things. But we can also there's also great freedom and great grace and great peace in intimacy and in a relationship with the Lord. I found that in my experience, not just in my marriage or my friendships, but I mean, really, if you're at all a person of faith, who believes that there's a God who's like calling us to eternal life, then like just walk with us, and be patient with us, because we're all headed to that. We're all headed to that like ultimate intimacy with God, and it's never going to be enough. Nothing. Even the person who has the most beautiful marriage, the most pleasurable sex, the most amazing friendship group, like it's never going to compare. So if you're wherever you are, like just come be with us. I love you. I know these guys probably would love you if they met you too, and so that's what I'll say.
Maybe not. Maybe I do.
Maybe.
I
know Josh is working on me. He doesn't want to commit to all these strangers now too.
Yeah, we're 3 minutes up. We're gonna go in the final stretch, but first, I'm not letting Father Pat get out. So this podcast would not be possible without the lovely supporters who are patrons or who are on our Patreon page. And so, Father Pat, how do we thank them, and how do we encourage the listener or the viewer to become a patron on our Patreon page? Do this in a I don't know, old Irish accent. Go ahead.
Well, we have to say thank you to all of those who have given of themselves and have reached into their own pockets, especially those who have experienced at some point some kind of aches and pains of trying to make ends meet. Thank you for your support. You don't have to understand how Patreon works in order to use the Patreon. It's there for all of us to use. And I'll say that I use the Patreon, but not in the way that you're expecting. And I do indeed appreciate that so many people are supporters.
There you go. Are you all right? This guy sounded like he was on his last leg. This guy was out. He's like, this guy was.
It was one breath.
How was that? Oh my gosh! It sounds like a robotic Swede? Robotic Swedish.
Just for
Stop.
you, Owen.
We're
Just
going
for you.
down.
I'll record your voicemail.
There you go. There you go. But no, seriously, folks, if you like what you hear and you want to be a part of the journey and with exclusive content by Father Pat, which is coming, and now Anthony, I'm gonna add anything after this. We're gonna put up there too on the Patreon content. So definitely subscribe and enter into that, whether it's $3, $5, your coffee, your $7, your $15, your $30. You get a Holy Ruckus mug, a little t-shirt, a little deep v-neck, however you like it. That's what we're doing at the Holy Ruckus. And here we are at the last stretch. It's 7:00. Father Pat, let's look through some of these questions. Let's see. There was a really good one here by Marisol. Marisol Lopez says, how do I speak? I don't know. I'm just reading this. How do I speak to someone in my family dealing? How do I speak with someone in my family dealing with same-sex attraction or any other LGBTQ folks? Go ahead. I imagine this is for you, Tony, because
Yeah. No, this is a great question, and we kind of started to talk about like just the kind of attitude of humility to take, right? But so I think, you know, whether you're a pastor, a parish leader, or just friend or family member, you know, it's important to know, first of all, it's okay to not know immediately what to say. You know, especially as someone like is initially like coming out to you, chances are this was like a really big step for them to open up to you about this part of their life. So just try to like listen to their voice, read their body language, understand how they might be feeling in the moment. You know, try to build that sense of empathy. And you might, depending on what they share and how they appear to feel, you might say something like, "Oh, that took a lot of courage to share with me. You know, thank you for trusting me with that." And try not to like ask a bunch of questions right off the bat. Sometimes curiosity can show that you share in the right context, but people should also like be given the space to share their life at a pace that's comfortable for them. So you could say something like, "I'm here to listen whenever you want to talk." You know, and a lot of times those kinds of things, even though they seem like, oh, like that's not an answer to my question, like I want to talk with them, a lot of times that kind of empathy and those invitations can actually give people a type of permission to open up more and to share more and to ask you questions. And so you have to start from that space of building trust, you know, affirming people, even family members. A lot of time we assume like, oh, they know I love them, they know whatever, but we have to say those things, you know, I still love you. You know, I'm not the person here to judge you or even tell you what to do. You know, I'm here to listen and you know, how can I help? So I think just starting there is important.
go ahead real quick, Father.
You have a bat. Can you give us an example of something going poorly or badly? Like, don't do that.
Oh yeah, sure.
Someone doing it badly, trying to like help you or deal with you or treat
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things. I mean, one I mentioned in my essay where I was in when I was in college, I was in this like formation program, where it was like a discernment program for people young guys thinking about becoming a priest, and this topic came up with the formation director, and all of a sudden he just like launched. It was like a free association, I think, for him into like defining like what a pedophile and a pederast is, and I mean, there's a huge conversation about like why we associate those things to begin with. But I think that it was really just for him was like they were associated and he just started talking. Maybe he was uncomfortable. I'm not sure. You know, sometimes people in a sexual minority are like lumped into this like sexual deviance category. You know, and it's especially painful, especially in this time where we're still dealing with the sex abuse scandal and you know, not only like current behavior but all the ripples from it and stuff. And so as a faithful person who would like never dream of engaging in that behavior and has a completely different experience than those perpetrators, it's really painful to be lumped into that. But that's a lot of people do that. Another thing I know from a friend who had this experience, who went to a spiritual advisor when a family member came out to them, And the spiritual advisor said first, well, I'm not an expert. I don't really know a lot about this topic or what to say, but then very confidently advised the person, well, if they enter into a romantic relationship, you cannot have them over for dinner. And I just thought that was the most insane thing. First of all, and being paired with like, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm going to give you a really strong piece of advice. And then especially just because it seems so unbiblical to me, even if you think someone that this is like the height of sin, to think that you shouldn't dine with sinners, considering our Lord and Savior did just that all throughout Scripture. And so, so I think
read that one. Missed that one.
So I think we got to go back to basics sometimes and just like remember it's not just all mushy gushy. It's like let's follow the example of our Lord. It's very biblical. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Well, counter to that, what has helped you, and what are some resources coming from the church, from the Catholic Church that you, or even not just in the umbrella Christianity, like what are some things that you've really latched onto as a you mentioned eat an invitation. If you want to give a little to that, what do you got for someone that may be listening or that knows somebody feeling?
Yeah. So I mean, so I gave these negative examples, but of course, you know, I had a wonderful youth minister growing up who, you know, when I kind of talked about my experience of being bisexual with her, her initial response was, you know, because specifically I said, you know, I was really hurt by this thing that someone said, and I said, how is this supposed to help? What am I going to do? I don't know. And she just said, I don't know. And it seems really dumb. Like many people might think that they failed in that moment. But to me, that like the humility that she had and the humility to come into an interaction and just admit to someone, I don't know. But it was in her tenor too, that was like, I feel you. Like, I'm sorry. I'm here. You know, I heard all of that in the way that she talked to me. And so again, I think and that's my experience, right? That made a huge difference for me to know that a person in leadership in ministry had my back and you know, was a confidant, and we remained close for a long time. And so I really appreciated that accompaniment. In terms of resources, unfortunately, there's not this huge wealth of Orthodox pastoral Catholic resources that I'm aware of and would personally endorse. But there are some things I would definitely point people to. A ministry called Eden Invitation that you mentioned. They're founded by other alumni of Franciscan University, where you and I, Josh, graduated from. They're incredibly faithful and intentional in the resources they and community that they develop. So they have some videos on their Facebook page in terms of those of you asking for practical ways to engage sexual minorities, stuff that came out of what do we do during Pride Month and stuff. But they also do a lot of community development. So if you're identify as, you know, lesbian, gay, same-sex attracted, queer, trans, and are Catholic or even Christian, and want to find community with other faithful, head over to Eden Invitation. They do seasonal book clubs. They have other ways that they gather for community, and so feel free to connect with them. They host retreats and stuff too sometimes. A couple books I might recommend reading. One is by Catholic Eve Tushnet, who's also local to DC here, where Josh and I are at. She is involved along with some others with the ministry at the Cathedral of St. Matthew downtown. She wrote an awesome book called Gay and Catholic. So I would definitely recommend that. Another book by a Catholic that I know has been kind of controversial is Building a Bridge by Father James Martin.
We don't talk about him here. No.
I find it really unfortunate.
He's still a priest of God, man. He's still a priest of God.
I find it really unfortunate that at least that book is so controversial, because it's actually it kind of very basically talks about kind of what I was getting at in terms of this approach to conversation and dialogue, and it's really I think it's actually really revolutionary in the way that it speaks to both people in the church engaging in this conversation from the outside, and people in the LGBT community, maybe even those outside of who are kind of outside of the church or feel outside of the church teaching. how they should engage each other in dialogue. And that's solely what it's about. That's solely its purpose, is to engage them to dialogue better. And so I think it's a worth the read. A couple others I would recommend too. One is, this guy is not Catholic, but I think if you can navigate that well, it's a really great. It's by Wesley Hill. It's called Washed and Waiting. He has some other books. I think he was the one who wrote Spiritual Friendship, but he's a great author in the what kind of another way to talk about LGBT Christians is this like side B people, LGBT Christians who subscribe to a traditional sexual ethic. So he's a big leader in the side B community. So that would definitely be worth reading. Obviously, you can find my essay on the Holy Ruckus and on my website. The last book I want to recommend, just because it's a very different thing I just saw before I got on with you guys on my bookshelf, is the biography of a guy named Father Michael Judge. I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard of him. The vast majority of the biography and of his story is about his discernment, his life becoming a priest and working as a Franciscan and as chaplain to the fire and I think fire department in New York City. He was the first recorded casualty on 9/11. There's a really beautiful picture of him being carried on a chair by firemen out of Ground Zero, and he had a beautiful life, was an awesome witness, and a small part of his life was that he was same-sex attracted, or however he defined it. There's some controversy in corners of the internet of people who don't want that to be a part of his story, but it is. And I think what's really important is that he did ministry with LGBT Christians, and when there was a desire from some of his like superiors and bishops and stuff to change how he was doing ministry that he didn't necessarily even maybe understand or maybe even agree with, he was faithful to that vow of obedience, and continued to have a deep love and minister to those people, even in the midst of kind of the pain of following those orders. And I just think that's like so needed, is not only someone who had that experience, who has a beautiful radical witness, but also someone who just like navigated something that, I don't know, they may or may not have like really subscribed to, but like walked in faith, as I was kind of talking about. So I think really beautiful story. It was really inspiring to me when I read, and then there's a documentary called The Saint of 9/11 about his life as well. So definitely recommend that, especially to people who have this experience, identify as LGBT or same-sex attracted. Check out Father Michael Judge. Yeah.
I got one more, and this is my last one. I don't know if Father has anything after this, but sometimes, I mean, I look at the way the church is evangelizing, and I look at the way we go about certain issues and certain topics, and maybe to the ball game or just arriving or a little slow on how to, the theory and everything is all there. It's all there in scripture and what we have in Revelation, and I don't know, just an embarrassment of riches kind of thing. We're in a good, we have such the potential to do this and to act on it, right? So the ideals are all there, but then when it comes to executing, we fumble the ball here. And we talked about the epic fails, but also the resources and things that are coming out that have been good for you in the accompaniment. But I guess for you, what keeps you staying on the boat? What keeps you still rowing and still trusting and still communing with the church that don't get you or don't want or these communities. Like what is it like that keeps you going?
Yeah, I think it's another really good question, right? Because there has been, I mean, even sharing this essay, you get a call from somebody and it wasn't received the way you want it to be received, or share something on Facebook and you get some weird comments or whatever. But even just historically, I mean, there's been times in my life where I've been asked not to share about this part of my life, again, from people who I think were just fearful of what that would mean, how other people would react. And it is, to be honest, to kind of rise to your question, it is really painful and it is really tough. And I think to call people to task, actually, I'd say we need to be really honest about that, about what kind of environment we are creating for people who have a different experience than us, because it comes to a point in spiritual community where if you know, and this is not a perfect parallel at all, but I mean, we segregated historically a lot of like the Black Catholic Church into their own parishes, right? And that was their coping mechanism in a sense, or what they were allowed in order to survive as faithful within the church. And you kind of box people in when you create a radically unhospitable environment to either leave, to segregate themselves, or to feel as if they're in an abusive relationship, right? Because a lot of people, with my experience, like still have this great desire, you know, to be with the Lord, to be in, and also to be in community, right? And it starts to feel like, oh man, why am I still hanging out with these people who just keep hurting me over and over and over again? And so I want to just like first say that we have to be honest with ourselves about the environment. You know, how we accompany people has really radical ramifications. It's all about the environment within the church community that we create, and that human community is how Christ is or is not made manifest to our brothers and sisters. For myself, why I stay in spite of that is, first of all, that's not my reality all the time. I've been hurt by people, but it doesn't mean that I'm always hurt, or that idea of an abusive relationship is a one-to-one comparison at all. There's even people who have not done things perfectly have also given me a lot of really beautiful support as well. And I've been able to be merciful with them, and given them the benefit of the doubt that we're all trying to kind of navigate and understand and grow in our capacity for walking our journey of faith, and also accompanying other people who we don't share an experience with. And that can be difficult. So I think that's one thing, is just is trying to grow in humility myself. And I think seeking healing in community, I mean, that's something, like I mentioned, having more community with other LGBTQ Christians, in particular because they understand those experiences of pain. And I think just like you would get together with a support group of people who have a similar experience of pain with you to help in your healing process, that's part of what that community affords me, is like a feeling of healing and of hope, that we have a place in the church. But I would love to see more of those people be empowered and feel comfortable being open about their witness with everyone. But I think ultimately, like I mentioned earlier, is this desire to be with the Lord. I mean, I believe that the faith is true, and I want the community to be something that isn't in itself a cross, but feels like an Easter celebration, right? And that because life offers us enough crosses, that the community of the church should itself not be a cross, but should be a place of grace where the Holy Spirit dwells and refreshes us. And so I hope for that, and I do find that often. But ultimately, I follow Christ, you know, wherever He leads me, and more often than not, I've had a lot of peace, even in the most difficult of moments.
Awesome.
Amen.
Beautiful. Father Pat, anything as we close it out?
Another thanks. Just thanks for giving us this part of yourself, and for joining us today. I hope it's not the last time. I expect it won't be the last time, especially because there's many other things that we share in common that I know we'd make a good episode out of. So
I would love it. I'll be back anytime. You guys are great hosts.
Awesome.
Okay.
I'm not letting you go that easy, though. Before we go, also in your bio, you didn't include this, but I'm going to throw it in there. Tony, you were a stand-up comedian? Or
Oh
are
gosh.
a stand-up comedian?
Yeah. I have been known to do some stand-up comedy.
Yeah, some chops? Okay. Go ahead and make us laugh.
Oh my God.
Oh, come on, Pat. Come on.
You're giving me like a dance monkey command? Is that?
Oh, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay, let me think. I did do some stand-up bits or some stand-up shows in DC. That was like a rough scene.
Oh.
at some moments, man. That was not easy. And I'm stalling right now, pretending like I'm being nostalgic for those moments, thinking
No, it's okay.
thinking of a bit.
Everybody's got a joke, right? You've got to have a joke.
Oh man, you know what? I'm not a like Mitch Hedberg comedian. I don't have like one-liners. I'm like a storyteller, you know. So I gotta have that
There you go.
that good story. But
That's another podcast. There you go.
yeah, you know what? I gotta prep something and I'll come back. But
Awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to and watching the Holy Ruckus podcast. Father Pat, Tony Esser, and myself. You've been beautiful. You've been great. Thanks so much for the comments in the comment section. Do us a favor. Go ahead and give us a 5-star review. Give us a like on the interwebs about the podcast if you like it. If you like this podcast, we got more coming. We got a marriage podcast now, another marriage podcast called The One You Gave Me, Play on Genesis. And we also have Father Dan Leary and Kevin Wells podcast called 1-to-1 about missionary priest journey that he's on over in Mexico. Anything else, Father Pat?
Be good to your people. I hope you weather this storm. We could even see like the lightning flashing at you on your camera there.
We got a hurricane in the East Coast. Tony, anywhere else we can find you aside from the Holy Ruckus?
Tony?
me? Oh, yeah. I thought you were talking. Yeah, you can find me the Holy Ruckus. You can find me on my website, anthonyesser.com, on Facebook. I'm at Anthony Esser Photography and Design. So that's my graphic design page. And but yeah, hopefully be doing more. I put out some videos with the Holy Ruckus, and love to be on again. Like I said, better with you. Check out our 9 wonderful episodes, and maybe we'll release some more friendship content in the future.
I'm sure there are shows that had that kind of run before. So, you know, it's all good. That were just
that's the pod fade, man. That's what they call it. It's like 7 to 9 episodes.
Okay.
I thought when I got past 7, I was like doing it, and then after 9, I was like, oh no.
You didn't get that runner's high, that podcast high. No,
man. That was tough. I was producing that thing like it was an NPR podcast while I was like working full time. I was like,
it's tough, man. 9 episodes, tough. One less than another hit show that only had like 10 episodes, Muppet Babies on Disney Plus. So,
well, good company then.
Yes, there you go, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for listening, hanging out with us. The Holy Ruckus podcast, your favorite podcast. Buenas noches. Good night. Hit us up.
Peace.